Power of My Mind, Reflections of a Queer Latina Mental Health Activist. Dior is a Latina feminist mental health activist and the creator of the People of Color and Mental Illness Photo Project. Her work has been covered in media outlets such as Forbes, Newsweek, NBC News Latino, and The Guardian. Direct from a red-eye flight and awake. Please welcome Dior Vargas.
Am I the only one, or was it very hard to see all those wasted tissues? I was like, I could use that one, that one, that one. I'm like, it's going to waste. Yeah. Oh. So, how's everyone? Okay. So, when I was 8 years old, I wrote in my diary that my life was over. And I don't know if I'm the only one, probably not, but like I have like all these old diaries that I used to write in. The one that I wrote that in was like this bare diary with a lock that I could never figure out how to work. So this is actually it. And that, what it says right here, July 11th, 1995, my mom wrote that. And I was like, good, because I would never know when that actually happened. So I was 8. And it says, my life is over, in case you can't read it, because I did not have the nicest handwriting. I don't even know what utensil I used to even write that. Like marker, like crayon. But it says, my life is over. It's hard, like, after listening to everybody, I'm like, okay, don't cry, like, my life is over. My mom says, no, my life is not over. Well, I think so. The end. I used to always write the end after every diary entry. Like, that's it. So when I wrote that, it was about 2 years after my biological father left. And it was because there was a lot of domestic violence in my household. And I experienced it through my father, but also through my uncle, my mother's brother. My grandparents lived in the same building as my mom and my sister and I did. So we were on the 18th floor and they were on the 12th. And so I was so lucky to have my maternal grandparents there with me. So when I was around 6, my parents separated. And before then, I was daddy's little girl. Like, I would be such a brat when I was little, and my father would just do everything he could to make sure I was happy. And my father was, he preferred me because I was light-skinned. My sister was darker-skinned. And so to him, I was worth more, or I needed to be doted on more. And so when he left, I truly didn't know what to do. I'm always the one that cries. So there would be times when he would, thank you. If you would have left it on the floor, I would have just grabbed it from the floor. So like, So he would show up, everything would be fine, and then he would disappear out of nowhere. Like, and I was like, what did I do? What did I say? And I think that's kind of why in my current relationship, I'm like, did I say something? Are you mad at me? Like, are you gonna leave? Like, that uncertainty, I think, is a huge part of my relationship because of my father. So, Sorry, it's the computer. So anyway, so when my mom, when my parents were still together, my father said to my mom, "You can't work. You're a woman, you're a second-class citizen, you can't work. You have to stay home and take care of the kids." And it was my sister and me. And so the whole time, my mom was under the assumption that my father had been paying rent the entire time. And right before he left, it had been months since he had paid rent. And so all of a sudden, we kept on seeing eviction notices. And it's funny, because very early on in my life, I knew what eviction meant. But then I also learned that the way my building worked, I guess they put eviction notices, but nothing ever really happened. But there was always this threat of not knowing where I was going to live. And, he said, "Well, that's your responsibility. I don't live there anymore. You have to pay for rent." But he didn't allow her to work, so how was she going to do that? And so what was really horrible was that we ended up having to go on welfare, but what the horrible part was that when my mom said, "I need help, like I don't know what to do," he said, "Well, I don't care if you end up on the streets and die hungry, like that's your thing." And so there would be times where we would just eat ice for dinner, and my mom would be like, "Just think of it as like macaroni and cheese, or just think about whatever it could be that's like your favorite meal." So I remember just chewing on that ice and being like, "Okay, what is this meal that I'm having?" Trying to think of maybe what could be a better life for me. But I didn't see that, and that's why I wrote, like, my life is over. What is left for me? And so I think as anyone who's going through trauma and going through a lot, I just learned how to cope. And so that just involved me trying to end my life repeatedly. When I was 8, clearly there was suicidal ideation, and at 11, I was going through bullying in school, and I just didn't want to live anymore. So I attempted. I wrote a suicide note. I think sometimes there's this idea that Latinas are very like theatrical and dramatic, and so I was like, no, I'm gonna write a suicide note. It's gonna be this big thing. And so I tried, and I woke up the next morning and nothing happened. And that was the case for me every single time. From the ages of 11 to 18, that's what I did. That's how I coped. Because I think what other people have said is that everything was so much out of control. I had no control over anything that happened in my life, that I was like, okay, this is the one thing I could control. And the other thing that I felt like I could control was school. My grandmother raised my sister and I to work so hard at school. She's like, that's the only thing that you have that no one could take away from you. And so I worked extremely hard, was in first honors every year in high school. And so that's how I dealt with things. And for me, I just felt like I couldn't express myself to my family. My mom, for a huge chunk of my life, well, actually she still is severely depressed. But for a huge chunk, it was debilitating for her, and she couldn't do it. And a lot of times that's where my grandmother stepped in and took care of us. And so, like Shamiqua, like my grandmother's, I'm like, oh God, she's gonna cry again. My grandmother has Alzheimer's right now, and I just realized that she hasn't said my name in years, because she doesn't know it anymore. And so anyway, she was the only one that made me feel like crying was not a sign of weakness. She always told me it's okay to cry. There's nothing wrong with it. Meanwhile, my mom, I think she was trying to be so strong that she was just like, no, you can't be a crybaby. You have to be tough. So having those competing things being told to me, I really didn't know how to behave, how to act. And so I felt that I couldn't express myself to my family. And in my family, like most communities of color, like you think that people of color can't have mental illness, that it's a white person thing, that only people who have the privilege or the resources to see a therapist, those are the only people that either have a mental illness or deserve it, or deserve the treatment, rather. And so that was something that if you had any complaints, you did it at home, but yet I felt like I couldn't even express it there. And so, like others have expressed, I just kept it inside. And I think that, so Latina teenagers in the United States have one of the highest attempted suicide rates, and it's not surprising to me considering that I'm one of those Latinas, but I think it also has to do with the fact that we're living in these two very different cultures where it's so Americanized and, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and, stand on your own 2 feet and survive and do what you have to do. Meanwhile, there's this other side where it's very family oriented and everything you do is about your family. And I remember watching a documentary about psychoanalysis in El Barrio, and where I grew up in Spanish Harlem, and there was a therapist who would ask their client, so how do you feel about this? And the person didn't reply as, well, I feel this. They replied, well, my mother feels this, or my grandmother, or this family member feels this. It's through one's family that we feel these things because we're thinking about how it reflects on them. And I think that that was also another thing that I was worried about in expressing what I felt, because I remember there was an article in Cosmo for Latinas, and it was about Latinas and them attempting suicide. And I remember speaking to the reporter and being so excited because I was like, wow, after all these years of volunteering and trying to see how I could help in terms of mental health, I had this opportunity to be in a magazine, and I was just putting it all out there. And when the magazine came out, in big block letters, it said, my mother slapped me and said, how could you do this to me? And that was from my last suicide attempt when I was 18. I had just finished my first year at Smith College, and I had never really been in a town that was so small. I'm from New York City. I'm from Manhattan. Like, everything is just so busy, and there's so many people. And then going to a town in Northampton where people just randomly smile at you, I just was like, what are you doing? Are you gonna attack me or something? It was just very awkward. And so I just was very depressed there. I felt very alone. It was a predominantly white serving institution, and so I didn't really see people who looked like me or my family, and so I felt very alone. And when I got home from that first year, I attempted, which was my last attempt in 2006. And after I tried, and I took a nap, and then I woke up, and it wasn't like the other times. I felt weird, I felt groggy, I felt dizzy, and I had already told my sister about my previous attempts, and she said, did you try anything? And I was like, well, yeah. And then she told on me to my mom, and that's when my mom was so overwhelmed with emotion, and she just smacked me, and she said, how could you do this to me? And so to have that in huge block letters in that magazine, it really just put out there what had happened, and I felt like I embarrassed my mom, that I embarrassed my family, when really all I wanted to do was to share my story and help other people see themselves through my life. So to kind of go back, when I was in high school, I decided I wanted to become an activist because I felt like I didn't have control over really anything in my life. And so if I could be an activist, if I could fight for something, fight for me, fight for my family, fight for my community, that was something that I could do. And so I covered so many different issues, reproductive rights, body image issues, domestic violence. I was like the gamut. Like I just was like, I'm gonna do everything. But it wasn't until 2013 when I decided that I wanted to do something else, and I realized that why am I not talking about mental health? Why am I not talking about what I've been going through for so long? And so I started Googling as much as I could, and very much of what Christina was saying is like so many images, black and white images, you know, people like going like this and just black and white, and it was just like, what is this? Like, this is not, I don't look like that all the time. I mean, it's a reality for some, but it's not reality for everyone. And it was also a lot of white women, and I was like, why don't I see anyone who looks like my community or my family? And so I decided that I would call myself a Latina feminist mental health activist. I know it was the longest term ever. But I was like, no, I'm Latina, I'm a feminist, I believe in intersectionality and how race and oppression impacts how people live their lives. And I wanted to separate myself from others and show that this was who I was about and what my work was gonna look like. And so I basically started asking, I started looking, and I saw that no one of color was represented, and I thought, okay, so what am I gonna do? So I thought, let me do a photo project. I saw so many different photo projects, but I thought, let me tackle something that isn't really being discussed or discussed as much as I would like. And so I created the People of Color and Mental Illness Photo Project. And these are some of the images that are in the online version of the project. It says, I'm not defined by my depression, nor will I allow society to define me by its misperceptions. And I thought, what could these images do to respond to the stigma, to respond to how people view people with mental illness? It says, I am not my anxiety, I am not my depression, I am not my illness, I am stronger because of it. I wanted to humanize people. I feel like people think that there's this look that people have. And I just wanted to show that people of different races, ethnicities, sexualities, genders, they go through this. It says, I'm battling social anxiety and depression. I'm a warrior. And so I quickly learned that a lot of people were using this project to share their story with their friends, their family members, and just to come out about what they've been going through. And I wanted to make it a common conversation in these communities. So after a while, I wanted to do more with the project. I wanted to see what I could do. And so I started a Kickstarter, and because I wanted to see how I can move this project forward and get these images out. And so through the Kickstarter, I worked with a photographer, and we took photos of 34 individuals. And I interviewed every single one of them and transcribed the interviews and basically pulled out what really stood out to me and what I thought people really needed to know about each of their experiences. And so the result is The Color of My Mind, Mental Health Narratives from People of Color. And this is something that I've put a lot of work in over the years, and I even use my loan money from school, because I'm a graduate student. I'm getting my master's in public health. And I used the loan money to fund this book because I believe in it so much, and I wanted to create a project that would reach people in so many different places. I'll just read the pull quotes. It says, if you're not getting that from external resources, you've got to look inside and give that to yourself. Trevor, he lost his mother very early on, and he felt like he had to be his own cheerleader. And he's a beautiful person. I enjoyed so much speaking to him and learning about him. Another person was Dom, who is an amazing individual who has a project to focus on people of color and LGBTQ communities. And they're working tirelessly. I see myself in them, and to be able to speak to so many different individuals and hear about their experiences, that's why I'm doing this work. And so this is just proof that so many people are going through this, and they're working hard, not only for themselves, but for their community. And Cynthia, she said, being in a community of people whose work is based on liberation, it's almost like this experiment of what freedom could look like. And she's done a lot of work with the Black Youth Project. And so, again, I wanted to show people who were in different stages of their lives, who were working to see what they could do to better their lives and other people's as well. And so I really wanted to talk about how the intersection between race and class and ethnicity and mental illness, how that all is part of this book. And a lot of people who I spoke to talked about the lack of access, the lack of people of color in mental health, in the mental health profession, and the lack of people who are culturally competent, who are understanding of their experiences. I remember once I was speaking to a therapist, and I was talking to her. It was actually my first or second year at Smith, and those are one of the free sessions. And she was like, well, you need to stand up to your mom. You need to talk back, and you need to tell her who's in charge. I was like, who? I'm like, do you know my mother? But also, do you know my culture? Like, do you know that, like, that does not fly? Like, that's. And so I felt attacked, I felt misunderstood, I felt like I had to defend my mom, and I had to explain who I was and where I was from, and that's not the point of therapy. And so hearing that repeated and hearing those themes through creating this book has really solidified why I need to do this work. So I really hope that my work continues to bring these vital connections to those who need to hear it. And I want my work to change how the system works. I would love to see my book in counseling centers and colleges and universities and in different areas where if people go into that office and see that and see someone who looks like them, that they'd feel more comfortable, or that would lead to hopefully better treatment. I'm trying to see how I can use my work to improve the system overall. And I mean, I knew this before I started my master's, but equitable healthcare is a right, it's not a privilege, and it should not be a luxury to have good mental health, to see someone, to have that access. And so we really need to work together to ensure that no one is turned away, that people get that equitable care when they seek it. And then no matter where they come from or who they are, that they're not denied that support. So that's my goal, that's my vision, and that is the color of my mind. And I want to thank you so much for listening to me, to listening to all of us, to being here, and to sharing this space. It's not easy, and I hope we continue to work together and support one another. Thank you so much.